In the final throes of World War II, Korea, long subjugated under Japanese rule since 1910, emerged into liberation under a cloud of geopolitical maneuvering as the Allied powers sought to manage the vacuum left by Japan's defeat a tumultuous moment that would set the Korean Peninsula on a path of division and conflict deeply influenced by burgeoning Cold War tensions, the legacies of colonial governance, and the competing ideologies of emergent global powers. The peninsula's fate was sealed in August 1945 following Japan's capitulation, with the Soviet Union entering the war against Japan on August 8th and quickly occupying northern Korea. Alarmed by the rapid Soviet advance, the United States acted swiftly. On August 10th, two U.S. military officers, Colonel Dean Rusk and Colonel Charles Bonesteel, drew the 38th parallel on a map, dividing Korea into northern and southern occupation zones. This demarcation, finalized in General Order No. 1 on August 17th and accepted by Stalin without consultation with Koreans, effectively allocated Seoul and the populous southern half to U.S. southern half to U.S. South administration, leaving the less developed north under Soviet control. From the outset, the division was intended as a temporary expedient. Allied leaders had entertained ideas of an international trusteeship, multinational interim governance intended to pave the way for Korean self-rule, but Cold War politics and growing mistrust between Washington and Moscow soon derailed these plans. In the north, the Soviet administration established parallel communist institutions through people's committees and elevated returning exiled communists, including Kim Il-sung, who had fought against Japanese forces and returned under Soviet auspices. In late 1945 and early 1946, these entities consolidated into the Provisional People's Committee for North Korea, with Kim as its chairman and source of authority, setting the stage for a centralized communist state. Simultaneously, Soviet-backed land reforms redistributed former Japanese-controlled land more equitably, a popular measure among peasant classes, and orchestrated the departure of landlords and opponents to the south. Approximately 400,000 Northern Koreans fled southward. In the south, the U.S. South, the U.S. military government, USMG, led by Lieutenant General John R. Hodge, imposed authority quickly, suppressing the Korean People's Republican Indigenous Provisional Government created by local leaders, declaring it illegal. Hodge retained certain Japanese administrative structures and collaborators initially for continuity, while disbanding people's committees and outlawing strikes. The U.S. policy emphasized establishing a strong anti-communist government, culminating in the drafting of a constitution by an interim legislative assembly and the selection of Syngman Rhee as head of a provisional government. As 1946 unfolded, Cold War tensions continued to deepen. A U.S. Soviet Joint Commission, created at the Moscow Conference in December 1945 to plan for Korean reunification under trusteeship, foundered. Mutual suspicions and disagreements prevented any meaningful progress. Movement across the 38th parallel became increasingly restricted by May 1946. Travel required special permits, and an emerging pattern of political divergence took root, with the north moving towards socialist state building and the south edging toward capitalist, anti-communist institutions. In 1947, the U.S. appealed to the United Nations to oversee elections aimed at forming a unified Korean government, but the Soviets obstructed UN commissioners from entering the north. As a result, elections went ahead only in the south in May 1948, paving the way for the Republic of Korea's establishment on August 15, 1948, with Syngman Rhee as president. Shortly thereafter, on September 9, 1948, in Pyongyang, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was founded under Kim Il-sung, and both governments, deeply influenced by their respective occupying powers, claimed legitimacy over the entire peninsula. This unilateral formation of separate regimes entrenched the division, moving it beyond a temporary post-war measure toward a permanent bifurcation of Korea. The stage was set for confrontation, as both states began supporting factions and conducting border skirmishes, underpinned by ideological conviction and backed by the U.S. and Soviet Union, respectively. Thus, the division of Korea in 1945 was a product of urgent military calculation, Cold War rivalry, colonial legacies, and ideological competition. The arbitrary line drawn at the 38th parallel, the successive formation of separate governments under external sponsorship, and the failure of international negotiation mechanisms sealed the peninsula's fate. Laying the groundwork for the catastrophic Korean War, that would erupt in 1950 and a division that endures to the present day. In the aftermath of Japanese colonial rule ending in 1945, Korea, liberated yet no less fractured, found itself cleaved in two by external powers. Its division at the arbitrary 38th parallel, birthing rival political systems under Soviet domination in the north and U.S. control in the south. This occupation, intended as provisional, hardened into an ideological schism as North Korea, firmly steered by the Soviets, quickly institutionalized communist rule, wielded land reforms to build legitimacy, and fostered a robust military and party apparatus around rising leader Kim Il-sung. While in the south, the U.S. military government, USAMJIC, led by Lieutenant General Hodge, suppressed indigenous political movements, retained elements of Japanese administration, stifled labor and dissident voices manifesting in events such as the massive September 1946 general strike that saw over 250 workers rallying in protest escalated into violent suppression of uprisings like the Daegu Autumn Rebellion, and prepared the groundwork for an anti-communist regime under South Korea, thereby fueling mounting animosity between the two regimes. From 1947 onward, diplomatic efforts for reunification faltered as U.S. and Soviet with an impasse at two commissions, the United Nations unable to mediate effectively coordinating its impact elections in the South. 1948 resulted in the establishment of the Republic of Korea under Rhee on August 15th, while the North proclaimed the Democratic People's Republic of Korea under Kim under Rhee on August 15th. While the North proclaimed the Democratic Peninsula. Governments maneuvered to destabilize the other. As both governments maneuvered to destabilize the South. Backed by Soviet arms and organization. People's Army, Kim Il-sung, began planning for an invasion to unify the peninsula under communist rule, calculating that the U.S. would not intervene militarily. Thus, through mounting ideological confrontation, diplomatic failure, political violence, and military preparation, tensions on the peninsula reached a breaking point by the end of 1949, setting the stage for the dramatic outbreak of war in June 1950. In the pre-dawn hours of Sunday, the 25th of June 1950, under the cover of darkness and a withering artillery bombardment, the Korean People's Army, KP, equipped and trained over months with Soviet and Chinese support, launched Operation Pakbong, initiating a sweeping and unannounced invasion across the 38th parallel, its ground and armored columns, including Soviet-made T-34 tanks and organized into multiple infantry and armored divisions, descended upon South Korean defenses from coast to hinterland in a meticulously coordinated blitzkrieg, catching the Republic of Korea Army, ROKA, completely off guard, severely underarmed with no tanks or heavy artillery, and deeply unprepared for conventional warfare of such ferocity and tempo. With forces varying in estimates from some 90,000 to over 135,000 well-equipped troops, the KPA secured beachheads and advanced in 6 major columns through strategic invasion corridors including Ongjin, Gaesong, Chuncheon, and the Sheet Edge Uijeongbu route, rapidly overwhelming ROK positions, capturing critical towns in turn, and collapsing South Korean lines in record time. In a purely tactical demographic shift that personified the onslaught's efficacy, South Korea's army, accounted at roughly 95,000 men on 25 June, was decimated to a mere 22,000 by month's end as chaos, fragmented organization, and retreat consumed the ROK forces. Seoul, the capital, capitulated by the 28th of June, prompting the South Korean government's desperate flight and leaving citizens and soldiers alike to abandon weapons, vehicles, and supplies, while environmental and humanitarian tolls mounted catastrophically. In a state of utmost urgency, U.S. President Harry S. Truman swiftly invoked United Nations mechanisms. On the 25th of June, the Security Council condemned aggression. The 27th of June saw a call for member states to aid South Korea, followed by Truman authorizing MacArthur to mobilize air, naval, and logistical support, including limited ground forces to defend critical positions such as Busan, and by the 7th of July, a unified United Nations command under USEG's leadership was established to marshal international military response. Amid this upheaval, infrastructure destruction intensified. The Han River Bridge in Seoul was demolished by the ROK Army on the 28th of June in a desperate bid to stem the KPA's approach, inadvertently causing mass civilian casualties and isolating South Korean forces north of the river. At sea, U.S. and Allied naval units evacuated thousands of civilians from Seoul while engaging in initial air combats, destroying North Korean aircraft and establishing early aerial defensive perimeter. Though limitations in range and resources constrained sustained air operations, thus, in a matter of days, North Korea executed a decisive sweeping invasion lethal in its speed, coordination, and surprise overwhelmed a vulnerable South, fractured the peninsula, and catalyzed a global response. The stage was set for a broader conflict under the banner of the UN and shaped by Cold War stakes as Korea plunged headlong into its most devastating chapter. The echoing thunder of artillery and the guttural roar of Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks reverberated through Seoul's streets in late June 1950 as the Korean People's Army, KPA, executed its rapid invasion and siege of the South Korean capital on operation that was both a military coup de grace and a humanitarian catastrophe following. Just 3 hours of frantic demolition of the Hangang-on River bridge by the South Korean Army, intended as a stalling measure. The bridge's destruction at approximately 2:30 a.m. on the 28th of June trapped retreating soldiers, police, and civilians, resulting in hundreds of casualties and disorientation as North Korean forces poured across the river almost immediately thereafter. Within hours, the KPA, riding the momentum of their blitzkrieg-style assault across multiple fronts, had swept into downtown Seoul targeting key infrastructure, seizing government buildings, and forcing President Syngman Rhee's administration into a hasty southbound evacuation first to Suwon, and ultimately the southeastern stronghold of Daegu. As the city fell, a darker terror unfolded at Seoul National University Hospital, where some 709 medical staff, patients, wounded soldiers, and civilians were summarily massacred, shot, or buried alive by invading troops in one of the earliest and most gruesome war crimes of the conflict. Against this backdrop of devastation, the United Nations Security Council converged in emergency session, passing resolutions demanding North Korea's withdrawal and authorizing collective military assistance to South Korea. Swiftly, President Harry S.S. Truman committed U.S. forces and 7th Fleet assets, including Carrier Task Force 77, to bolster a desperate defense and curb the communist advance. Bombers and jet fighters patrolled the skies, targeting troop concentrations and rail lines in the Seoul area to blunt momentum, though the capacity to protect fleeing civilians was woefully limited. In the wake of Seoul's fall, the cityscape began to fracture. Once proud Japanese-era edifices turned to rubble under shelling. Civilian infrastructure collapsed. Food and fuel scarcity swept across neighborhoods, and survivors huddled amidst destroyed homes and broken streets, facing hunger, uncertainty, and the specter of more violence to come, especially as North Korean forces rooted themselves within the heart of the capital, consolidating control and reshaping the lives of its inhabitants under occupation. Thus, within a single catastrophic week, Seoul transitioned from South Korea's nerve center to a battlefield ruin, its seizure marking not just a strategic conquest but a symbolic and psychological blow that echoed across the international stage and laid bare the brutal stakes of a war that had only just begun. When the summer of 1950 arrived, the Korean Peninsula had already been engulfed in a rapidly escalating war that began with the North Korean People's Army and KPA, crossing the 38th parallel in a full-scale invasion of the Republic of Korea on June 25th. Within just a few weeks, the North Korean advance seemed unstoppable. They had driven South Korean Oga and United Nations forces back in a series of crushing defeats, capturing Seoul and pushing the defenders steadily southward. By early August, what remained of the Allied forces composed mainly of South Korean units, and the hastily deployed United States 8th Army had been pressed into a shrinking area of southeastern Korea anchored around the port city of Pusan. This defensive position, which would later be immortalized in military history as the Pusan Perimeter, became the final line of defense before complete defeat. If the perimeter fell, there would be no organized resistance left in Korea. The peninsula would be entirely under communist control. The battle that followed was not a single continuous clash, but rather a sustained and coordinated defense against multiple, massive North Korean assaults from August through mid-September 1950, testing the endurance, resourcefulness, and determination of the defenders. The geography of the Pusan Perimeter played a critical role in its selection and defense. The area formed a rough rectangle about 140 miles long and 50 miles wide, bounded by natural barriers that gave the defenders some advantage despite their inferior numbers. To the south and east lay the Korea Strait, providing a secure sea route for reinforcements and supplies from Japan. To the north and west, mountain ranges and rivers such as the Nakdong provided partial natural defenses. The port of Pusan itself, located in the southeast corner, was of immense strategic importance. It served as the logistical lifeline of the United Nations Command WWII. Through Pusan's docks flowed not only weapons, ammunition, and food, but also the constant stream of reinforcements and heavy equipment ferried from Japan and the United States. Without Pusan, the UNC would have been cut off and inevitably destroyed. General Walton H. Walker, commanding the U.S. 8th Army, understood this with absolute clarity and famously told his troops, "We are going to hold this line. We are not going to retreat any further. There is no line behind us to defend. This is where we stand." By early August, Walker's 8th Army had roughly 92,000 troops inside the perimeter, including a mix of U.S. Arkansas Army divisions, Marine units, and battered South Korean formations. Facing them were approximately 98,000 NKPA soldiers, battle-hardened, experienced, and still enjoying the momentum of their offensive. However, the North Koreans were beginning to feel the strain of their rapid advance. Their supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain, and the destruction of infrastructure by retreating forces hindered their logistics. Despite this, they sought to crush the perimeter quickly before the U.S. and its allies could bring overwhelming reinforcements. The North Korean plan was a multi-pronged offensive, simultaneous thrusts across the Nakdong River in the west, toward Daegu in the center, and along the coastal routes in the east. The intent was to break the perimeter at multiple points, isolate defending forces, and seize Pusan before it could be further fortified. The opening stages of the battle saw intense fighting along the Nakdong River line. The most famous and desperate of these clashes was the First Battle of the Nakdong Bulge in early August. The NKPA's 4th Division succeeded in crossing the river under cover of darkness and established a lodgment within the American lines. The U.S. 24th Infantry Division, already battered from earlier engagements, fought tooth and nail to contain the penetration. Small unit combat was ferocious, often devolving into hand-to-hand fighting in the tangled hills and valleys. Air support and concentrated artillery fire eventually allowed the Americans to eliminate the bulge, but at considerable cost. This engagement demonstrated the nature of the entire Pusan Perimeter battle. There would be no single decisive clash, but rather a series of localized crises erupting almost daily as the North Koreans probed and hammered at weak spots in the defense. While the Nakdong sector drew heavy attention, the central approaches toward the provisional capital at Daegu were equally dangerous. Daegu served as Walker's headquarters and hub for communications and logistics within the perimeter. The NKPA committed several divisions to an encirclement attempt, advancing through the mountainous terrain and using infiltration tactics to bypass strong points. The defenders, comprising elements of the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division and the Aroka Corps, had to guard an enormous frontage while fending off determined assaults. The defenders' use of artillery, including massive concentrations of fire from 105 mm and 155 mm howitzers, was crucial in blunting these attacks. Close air support from the U.S. Air Force, operating from bases in Japan, and quickly repaired Korean airstrips, further prevented NKPA breakthroughs. The growing dominance of UNC air power was beginning to show. North Korean troops were harassed day and night, their movements constrained to darkness, and supply convoys repeatedly destroyed. In the eastern sector near the coastal city of Pohang, the situation was particularly chaotic. The NKPA's 5th Division, supported by guerrilla forces, sought to seize the town and the Yeonil airfield, which was vital for resupply and air operations. The U.S. 1st Marine Brigade, newly arrived in Korea, played a decisive role in stabilizing the front. The Marines conducted aggressive counterattacks that not only recaptured lost ground but also restored a sense of momentum to the UNC forces. These actions demonstrated that American units, when fully supplied and adequately supported, could seize the initiative even against an experienced enemy. Throughout August and early September, the fighting around the Pusan Perimeter was relentless. The heat and humidity of the Korean summer took a heavy toll on both sides. as did the exhaustion from near-continuous combat. For the North Koreans, the inability to breach the perimeter quickly became a strategic liability. Their casualties mounted alarmingly, and the supply shortages worsened. For the defenders, the key advantage lay in the steady buildup of reinforcements, U.S. divisions arriving from the United States, as well as British Commonwealth units, were funneled into the perimeter via Pusan, allowing Walker to rotate his exhausted frontline troops and plug gaps with fresh forces. By early September, the North Koreans launched one last massive offensive to break the perimeter before their window of opportunity closed. This attack included renewed assaults along the Naktom, heavy pressure against Daegu, and a drive toward Masan in the southwest. Once again, the fighting was desperate, but the defenders held firm. The increasing firepower available to the UNC artillery, tanks, and above all, airstrikes shattered many of the NKPA's attacking formations. In some sectors, the counterattacks were so effective that the North Koreans were forced into headlong retreat across the river. The final turning point came not directly at the Pusan perimeter, but through General Douglas MacArthur's bold decision to execute an amphibious landing at Incheon on September 15, 1950. This operation cut off the NKPA's supply lines and threatened to encircle their forces in the south. Within days, the pressure on the Pusan perimeter evaporated. The defenders launched a general counteroffensive, breaking out from the perimeter and pursuing the retreating North Koreans northward. The perimeter, which had symbolized desperate last-stand defense, became the springboard for a dramatic reversal of fortune. The victory at the Pusan perimeter was not simply a matter of holding ground, it was a testament to the strategic value of logistics, the effective coordination between ground, air, and naval forces, and the sheer determination of soldiers who knew there was nowhere left to fall back. The defense bought precious time for the United Nations to marshal its strength, transform a chaotic retreat into an organized resistance, and ultimately shift the momentum of the war. It also revealed critical weaknesses in the NKPA's ability to sustain long-term offensive operations, weaknesses that would be ruthlessly exploited in the weeks following Incheon. In the broader history of the Korean War, the Battle of the Pusan Perimeter stands as one of the defining moments of 1950. It was the crucible in which the hastily assembled United Nations Command proved its capacity to fight and endure. The battle was not glamorous, much of it was fought in mud, sweat, and desperation, but its outcome shaped the entire course of the conflict. Without the steadfast defense of Pusan, there would have been no Incheon landing, no liberation of Seoul, and perhaps no Republic of Korea as we know it today. The soldiers who fought there, whether American, South Korean, or from other allied nations, knew instinctively that this was the line that could not be crossed, and by holding it, they changed the fate of a war. By early September 1950, the situation on the Korean Peninsula seemed to have reached a critical point. The North Korean People's Army NKPA, which had surged southwards with breathtaking speed after its June 25th invasion, now faced its first significant check at the Pusan perimeter. The United Nations Command, UNC, under the overall leadership of General Douglas MacArthur, had managed to hold the line in the southeast corner of Korea, preventing total collapse. Yet holding the perimeter, though an accomplishment in itself, was not enough. MacArthur understood that the war could not be won by merely absorbing endless North Korean assaults. The strategic initiative had to be seized, and for that, a bold, decisive operation was needed, one that would shatter the enemy's momentum and reverse the tide of battle entirely. This is where MacArthur's gamble, the plan for an audacious amphibious landing at Incheon, was conceived, refined, and ultimately executed. The idea for an amphibious landing behind enemy lines was not entirely novel in MacArthur's mind. His experiences in the Pacific during World War II had shown him the power of amphibious maneuvers to outflank entrenched enemy forces. However, Korea's geography and the circumstances of 1950 posed unique challenges. The NKPA's strength lay in its deep penetration into southern Korea, with its supply lines stretched along the west coast and inland routes. If these lines could be cut, the entire North Korean force in the south might be trapped and destroyed. The west coast port of Incheon, located far to the northwest near Seoul, was ideally positioned for such a strike. It would sever the enemy's communications, threaten their retreat, and put the capital within striking distance. But Incheon was also notoriously unsuitable for amphibious operations, with extreme tidal variations, narrow channels, mudflats, and a heavily defended shoreline. When MacArthur first proposed Incheon as the target in early August, many senior officers were skeptical, including members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and even some within his own Far East Command, the U.S. Navy, tasked with delivering the invasion force, warned of the landing's hazards. The tides at Incheon could vary by as much as 32 feet, creating mudflats that could strand landing craft far from shore. The narrow approach channel meant ships would be vulnerable to coastal artillery for an extended period. Furthermore, the landing site was hemmed in by seawalls, requiring troops to scale vertical barriers under enemy fire. The preferred alternative for many planners was Pusan, further south, which offered a safer beachhead, though with less dramatic strategic effect. But MacArthur, confident in his assessment of the enemy's disposition and the psychological impact of a bold strike, rejected safer but less decisive options. MacArthur's reasoning was rooted in both military logic and his own audacity. He believed the NKA was overextended, with most of its combat power concentrated at the Pusan Perimeter. The rear areas, including Incheon and Seoul, were thinly defended, garrisoned mainly by second-line troops and security units. Striking there would not only sever supply lines but also deliver a psychological blow, shattering the North Korean assumption that the war's outcome was already decided. In MacArthur's mind, the very unsuitability of Incheon as a landing site was a virtue it would make the move unexpected. In a famous briefing at the Daiichi building in Tokyo on August 23rd, MacArthur presented his case with such conviction that Admiral Arthur Dewey Struble, commander of the U.S. 7th Fleet, and other skeptics were persuaded to proceed. We shall land at Incheon, MacArthur declared, and I shall crush them. The operation codenamed Operation Chromite was set for mid-September, giving only a few weeks for planning, assembling forces, rehearsals, and coordinating naval and air support. The primary assault force would be the U.S. X Corps, commanded by Major General Edward Almond, a close confidant of MacArthur. The Corps included the U.S. 1st Marine Division, the 7th Infantry Division, and supporting ROK units, totaling about 70,000 troops. The 1st Marine Division, led by Major General Oliver P. Smith, was selected for the initial landing because of its amphibious warfare expertise honed in the Pacific War. Meanwhile, the 8th Army, still engaged at the Pusan Perimeter, would launch a breakout once Incheon was secured, linking up with X-Corps and encircling the NKPI. Preparation for the landing required meticulous naval and logistical coordination. The U.S. Navy assembled one of the largest armadas since World War II, with over 230 ships, including aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, troop transports, and specialized landing craft. Minesweepers cleared approaches to Incheon. While naval gunfire missions were planned to suppress coastal defenses, air superiority was already firmly in UNC hands. Carrier-based aircraft from Task Force 77, along with U.S. Air Force planes operating from Japan and Korean airfields, conducted bombing runs on NKPA supply lines, troop concentrations, and defensive positions. These strikes were also aimed at misleading the enemy, suggesting that the main landing might occur elsewhere, such as at Kunsan or the West Coast ports closer to the front lines. One of the unique features of the Incheon plan was its dependence on precise timing dictated by the tides. There were only a few days each month when conditions would allow ships to enter the narrow channel, navigate the reefs and mudflats, and land troops close enough to the seawalls. The chosen date, September 15th, was selected because the tides would allow both an initial morning landing on the outlying island of Wolmido and an afternoon assault on Incheon itself. Wolmido, connected to Incheon by a causeway, was a key objective. Its artillery could command the approaches to the port. The 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, was tasked with seizing it in a preliminary strike. On the morning of September 15th, under a clear sky and with naval gunfire pounding the shoreline, the Marines stormed Wolmido. Resistance was lighter than anticipated, and by mid-morning the island was secured, providing a staging area for the main assault. That afternoon, riding the high tide, landing craft carrying Marines and soldiers approached Incheon's seawalls. Scaling ladders were used to overcome the vertical barriers, and despite small arms fire, the landings were remarkably swift. By nightfall, the beachhead was firmly established, and supplies were already being brought ashore. Casualties were far fewer than planners had feared, a testament to the overwhelming preparatory bombardment and the element of surprise. The following days saw rapid expansion of the beachhead. X-Corps pushed inland toward Seoul, encountering stiffer resistance as NKPA units hastily redeployed from the south. The battle for Seoul, fought from September 22nd to September 28th, was brutal urban combat. North Korean defenders, reinforced by elements of their 25th Brigade, fought street by street, using barricades, snipers, and booby traps. The Marines and Army units advanced methodically, supported by tanks and artillery. Civilian casualties and destruction in the city were heavy, but by the end of the month, Seoul was in UNC hands. The liberation of the capital was a symbolic triumph, bolstering South Korean morale and vindicating MacArthur's gamble. Meanwhile, the landing's strategic effect was devastating for the NKPA at the Pusan Perimeter, with their supply lines cut and retreat routes threatened. The North Korean divisions facing the 8th Army began to collapse. On September 16th, Walker's forces launched a general breakout, advancing rapidly as NKPA resistance crumbled. By late September, the remnants of the North Korean army were in full retreat northward, leaving behind vast numbers of prisoners, abandoned equipment, and shattered morale. In just 2 weeks, the balance of the war had shifted from near defeat to the possibility of total victory. MacArthur's gamble at Incheon was hailed internationally as a masterpiece of operational art. It combined strategic daring with meticulous execution, leveraging surprise, mobility, and the synergy of joint operations. Yet it also reflected MacArthur's personal style, uncompromising in the face of doubt, willing to take extraordinary risks for potentially decisive results. The success seemed to validate his belief that boldness, rather than caution, was the key to military success. However, as events in the months ahead would show, the same qualities that made Incheon a triumph could also lead to dangerous overreach. In the immediate aftermath, there was little doubt that Incheon was one of the most brilliant amphibious operations in modern history. It not only saved South Korea from collapse, but also opened the door to the UN advance beyond the 38th parallel. For the soldiers and Marines who carried it out, it was a testament to discipline, training, and the ability to adapt to difficult conditions. For the North Koreans, it was a catastrophic reversal from which they would struggle to recover, setting the stage for the next, far more complex phase of the Korean War. The landing at Incheon on September 15, 1950, was the thunderclap that shattered the strategic cohesion of the North Korean People's Army, NKPI. General Douglas MacArthur's audacious gamble had paid off. United Nations Command, UNC, forces were now ashore far behind enemy lines, threatening to cut off and destroy the bulk of the NKPA divisions locked in combat at the Pusan Perimeter. But MacArthur's vision did not end with the seizure of Incheon. His next and equally urgent objective was the liberation of Seoul, the Republic of Korea's capital city, which had been under communist occupation since the opening days of the war. The recapture of Seoul would not merely be a military achievement, it would be a political and psychological triumph, a visible symbol of South Korea's survival and the reversal of the communist tide. Seoul's significance was both symbolic and practical. As the capital, it was the seat of the South Korean government, and its liberation would bolster morale both domestically and internationally. Operationally, Seoul's location astride the main north-south highways and rail lines made it a logistical hub. Controlling it would further sever the NKPA's supply routes to the south. MacArthur was determined to seize the city quickly, before the NKPA could regroup or reinforce its defenses. He envisioned a rapid inland advance from Incheon, a lightning strike that would catch the enemy still disoriented from the surprise landing. Yet as the Marines and soldiers of X-Corps would soon discover, the battle for Seoul would be no simple dash. It would devolve into brutal urban combat, fought block by block and building by building, against determined defenders. From the moment Incheon was secured on September 15th, General Edward Almond, commanding X-Corps, pushed his troops forward towards Seoul. The 1st Marine Division, under Major General Oliver P. Smith, was given the primary role in capturing the city, supported by the U.S. Army's 7th Infantry Division and Republic of Korea Iraq Army units. The initial objective was to seize the high ground northwest of Incheon, control the approaches to the Han River, and cut the main road leading into Seoul. This required securing key intermediate objectives, notably the industrial and port areas along the Han estuary and the small but strategically placed city of Gimpo, home to an important airfield. On September 17th, just 2 days after the landing, the Marines launched their assault toward Gimpo airfield. The advance met sporadic resistance, as NKPA units, mostly rear area troops, fought delaying actions to cover the retreat of their main forces. By September 18th, Gimpo was in UNC hands, and engineers quickly began repairing its facilities. The airfield became an invaluable asset, allowing close air support aircraft to operate within minutes of the front lines and enabling rapid logistical resupply. This capture also cut one of the main NKPA evacuation routes from Seoul to the northwest, tightening the noose around the city. Crossing the Han River was the next major challenge. The NKPA had destroyed many of the bridges during their retreat earlier in the war, forcing UNC forces to improvise crossings using amphibious vehicles and portable pontoon bridges under intermittent artillery fire. The Marines and Army engineers worked relentlessly, often under direct enemy observation, to establish secure crossings. By September 20th, forward elements had reached the outskirts of Seoul, but the defenders, now reinforced by elements of the NKPA's 18th and 25th Brigades, had established formidable positions. The communists were determined to make the liberation of Seoul as costly as possible. Hoping to delay the UNC long enough for their forces in the south to escape encirclement, urban warfare in Seoul proved a bitter and bloody ordeal. The NKPA had fortified key buildings, erected barricades in the streets, mined intersections, and deployed snipers in upper floors and rooftops. The Marines' advance was measured in yards rather than miles. As every intersection became a small battlefield, tanks and artillery played a crucial role in blasting open routes, but the narrow streets and rubble made maneuver difficult. Infantry units relied heavily on grenades, flamethrowers, and close-quarters combat to clear enemy positions. Civilian casualties were tragically high, as thousands of residents remained trapped in the city, caught in the crossfire or victimized by NKPA reprisals. By September 23rd, the UNC had established a firm foothold in the western districts of the city. The fighting intensified around the government complex in Seoul's central rail station, both of which were heavily defended. The Marines' progress was methodical, advance by day, consolidate at night, and push forward again with combined arms support. The NKPA counterattacked repeatedly, using small mobile units to infiltrate through gaps in the lines and harass supply convoys. Yet despite their tenacity, the defenders were steadily pushed back. On September 26th, UNC forces captured the government complex, raising the South Korean flag over the capital's heart. Resistance in the city rapidly collapsed, though pockets of die-hard NKPA troops fought on for another 2 days. By September 28th, Seoul was officially declared liberated. The streets, however, told a grim story. Buildings reduced to rubble, bodies lying unburied, and tens of thousands of civilians homeless or destitute. South Korean President Syngman Rhee triumphantly re-entered the city, delivering speeches proclaiming the nation's survival and praising the UNC's heroism. The liberation of Seoul had immense political repercussions. For the United Nations, it was a vindication of the decision to intervene in Korea, proving that collective action could reverse aggression. For the South Korean government, it restored legitimacy and bolstered national morale. For the NKPA, it was a devastating blow. Both militarily and psychologically, their rapid retreat northward left them disorganized and vulnerable to pursuit. Yet the battle also revealed the grim cost of urban warfare. The Marines suffered significant casualties over 2,000 in the division, while the Army and ROK forces also paid heavily. Civilian deaths numbered in the thousands. The city's infrastructure was in ruins, and its population traumatized by months of occupation and days of intense fighting. Still, the liberation marked a turning point. With Seoul secure, the UNC now faced the question of whether to halt at the 38th parallel or press the advantage into North Korea, a decision that would lead to the next, far more perilous phase of the war. By late October 1950, the Korean War had undergone a breathtaking transformation. In the space of just 6 weeks, United Nations Command, UNC, forces had gone from defending the Pusan Perimeter to sweeping deep into North Korea. General Douglas MacArthur's masterstroke at Incheon had shattered the North Korean People's Army NKPA, liberated Seoul, and set the stage for a massive counteroffensive. Pursuing the retreating enemy, UNC troops crossed the 38th parallel in early October, advancing toward the Yalu River, the boundary between North Korea and the People's Republic of China. MacArthur was confident that the war's end was in sight. His stated goal was home by Christmas, and he assured Washington that the NKPA had been effectively destroyed. Yet even as UNC columns pressed northward through the rugged Korean mountains, a far more formidable adversary was preparing to enter the conflict. In Beijing, the decision to intervene had been simmering for months. Chinese leader Mao Zedong viewed the UNC advance toward the Yalu as an unacceptable security threat. The new People's Republic of China, proclaimed in October 1949, had only just emerged from decades of civil war, but its leaders were acutely aware of their vulnerability, with the United States firmly allied with the Republic of China at Taiwan, and now pushing forces to China's very doorstep. Mao feared Korea could become the staging ground for an invasion of Manchuria. There was also the question of revolutionary solidarity. North Korea's Kim Il-sung was a fellow communist ally, and the fall of his regime would represent a strategic and ideological defeat. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, privately encouraged Chinese intervention, promising material support but avoiding direct military commitment that might provoke a U.S.-Soviet clash. On October 8, 1950, just one day after UNC forces crossed the 38th parallel, Mao formally ordered the creation of the Chinese People's Volunteers CPV-FEI. This force was nominally volunteer to avoid a direct declaration of war, but in reality it was composed of regular units from the People's Liberation Army, BLO. Command was given to the battle-hardened General Peng Dehuai, who had distinguished himself in China's Civil War. Peng's initial force numbered around 260 troops, drawn from seasoned divisions accustomed to operating in rugged terrain and in austere conditions. Their plan was to cross the Yalu covertly, conceal their strength, and strike at overextended UNC units before the enemy realized they were facing a new opponent. The terrain of northern Korea favored such an operation. The mountains, narrow valleys, and sparse road networks made large-scale mechanized advances difficult and provided cover for infiltration. As UNC forces surged north in two main drives, 8th Army along the west coast and X-Corps landing at Wonsan and advancing along the East Chinese units. Slipped across the Yalu at night, blending into the local terrain and villages, American aerial reconnaissance detected some movement. But MacArthur's headquarters dismissed reports of major Chinese intervention as unlikely, interpreting them as isolated volunteers or remnants of NKPA forces. The first Chinese blow came at the end of October in what became known as the First Phase Offensive. On the night of October 25th, CPV units struck suddenly at South Korean divisions operating in the mountains near Anjong and Unsan in the northeast. The ROK 1st Division was badly mauled, and elements of the U.S. 8th Cavalry Regiment were cut off and nearly annihilated at Unsan then. Just as suddenly, the Chinese pulled back, melting into the hills. This led many UNC commanders to believe they had faced only a limited spoiling attack. In reality, Peng had deliberately halted the offensive to lure UNC forces deeper into North Korea, stretching their supply lines and increasing their vulnerability. In November, MacArthur ordered a full-scale advance toward the Yalu in what he called the Tea-Home by Christmas offensive on the western front. The 8th Army pushed north toward Senyuju, while in the east, X-Corps advanced through the Chosin Reservoir area. The weather turned bitterly cold, with sub-zero temperatures and biting winds that froze rivers solid and made life miserable for troops on both sides. It was in this freezing, mountainous landscape that the Chinese struck again, this time in overwhelming force. On November 25th, the CPV launched their second phase offensive, hitting the 8th Army along a broad front in the west and encircling the 1st Marine Division and attached Army units at Chosin Reservoir in the east. Chinese tactics emphasized night attacks, bugle calls, and massed infantry assaults, often overwhelming UNC positions by sheer numbers. The Americans, South Koreans, and other UN troops were shocked by the ferocity and scale of the assault. For many, it was their first realization that they were not dealing with scattered volunteers, but a massive, coordinated Chinese army. The results were devastating in the west. The 8th Army's line collapsed under the pressure, forcing a retreat southward. In the east, the Marines at Chosin fought their way out of encirclement in a heroic breakout, inflicting heavy casualties on the Chinese but losing ground. The retreat quickly turned into a general withdrawal. As MacArthur's forces abandoned hopes of ending the war in 1950 and instead focused on avoiding complete disaster, by early December, the UNC had been driven out of most of North Korea, and Seoul once again lay in the path of the advancing enemy. China's entry into the war transformed the entire conflict. What had seemed on the verge of a swift conclusion now stretched into a prolonged, grinding struggle. The U.S. public, stunned by the reversal, began to question earlier optimism. In Washington, President Truman faced the reality that the Korean War was now a confrontation not just with North Korea, but with Communist China, a vastly larger and more resourceful foe. Strategically, the Chinese intervention stabilized the North Korean regime, pushed the front lines back toward the 38th parallel and made any notion of a quick UN victory impossible. For the Chinese leadership, the intervention was costly but politically rewarding. It secured their northern frontier, demonstrated China's willingness to confront the United States militarily, and elevated Beijing's status in the communist world. Yet the price in lives was immense, with tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers killed or wounded in the winter fighting. For the soldiers on the ground, American, South Korean, and Chinese alike, the winter of 1950 was one of the most brutal campaigns of the modern era, fought in conditions as harsh as any battlefield of the Second World War. The harsh winter offensive of the Korean War marked one of the most grueling and brutal phases of the conflict, a time when the fury of the battlefield merged with the cruelty of nature to create an ordeal of suffering, endurance, and desperate strategic maneuvering. By late 1950, the conflict had already undergone a stunning series of reversals. In the early months, the North Korean People's Army, Incheon, had swept south in a rapid blitz, pushing the Republic of Korea, erupted, and its United Nations, UN, allies to the brink of defeat at the Pusan Perimeter. General Douglas MacArthur's daring amphibious landing at Incheon in September had turned the tide, liberating Seoul and driving North Korean forces into retreat. The momentum had shifted so completely that UN forces advanced toward the Yalu River, envisioning an imminent end to the war. Yet, in the shadows of the mountains and valleys of North Korea, the People's Republic of China had prepared a massive intervention, and by late November 1950, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, PVA, surged across the frozen landscape, catching UN forces off balance and transforming victory into a desperate fight for survival. The stage was set for a winter campaign of extraordinary hardship, as both sides contended not only with fierce combat but also with temperatures that plunged far below freezing, blizzards that obscured the battlefield, and logistical nightmares that tested the limits of human endurance. The Chinese intervention had begun quietly, almost invisibly, in October 1950, when Mao Zedong, convinced that an American presence along the Yalu posed a direct threat to Chinese security, ordered hundreds of thousands of troops into North Korea under the command of General WWII. These forces, adept at moving by night and concealing themselves in the rugged terrain, launched surprise attacks that stunned UN forces at places like the Chosin Reservoir and the Cheonggyeon River. By early December, what had seemed like the final push toward victory had become a grim withdrawal, as UN units, American, South Korean, British, Turkish, and others struggled to regroup in the face of relentless pressure. The bitter cold compounded the difficulties. Rifles jammed, machine gun belts froze stiff, vehicles refused to start, and frostbite claimed more casualties than enemy fire. Men learned to sleep in shifts simply to prevent freezing to death, and even the act of eating became an ordeal as rations turned to ice. In this environment, the very definition of combat changed. Survival itself became a strategic priority. One of the most famous episodes of the harsh winter offensive unfolded at the Chosin Reservoir, where the U.S. 1st Marine Division, along with attached Army and ROK units, found themselves surrounded by vastly superior Chinese forces in late November. Ordered to advance toward the Yalu, the Marines instead fought a desperate battle to break out and reach the coast at Hungnam. The march out of Chosin, later immortalized as the Frozen Chosin ordeal, was a test of discipline, courage, and unity under extreme adversity, with temperatures dropping to minus 35 F, minus 37 C. The Marines moved in tight columns, fighting off repeated ambushes while evacuating their wounded and preserving their equipment. Chinese soldiers, lightly equipped but hardened to the cold, pressed the attack in wave after wave, often at night, relying on their ability to infiltrate UN lines and exploit the terrain. For every mile gained, the Marines paid in blood, yet their orderly withdrawal preserved a core of combat power that might otherwise have been annihilated. Elsewhere along the front, the Chinese launched their second phase offensive, striking UN forces across a broad front from the east coast to the central mountains. At the Cheonggyeon River, the 8th Army under General Walton Walker faced intense pressure, with ROK divisions collapsing in places and American units executing hurried retreats. The Chinese strategy hit hard, encircle, and cut off was designed to exploit the extended supply lines and overconfidence of the UN advance. Entire battalions found themselves isolated, and the retreat southward often became a chaotic scramble under fire. The roads, clogged with military convoys, refugees, and the wounded, turned into nightmarish bottlenecks as snowstorms reduced visibility and ice turned every bend into a hazard. The Chinese used the weather to their advantage, launching assaults in conditions that grounded UN air support. and slowed mechanized movement. For soldiers on both sides, the winter was not merely an environmental challenge, it was an active participant in the battle. By mid-December 1950, the UN High Command recognized that holding positions deep in North Korea was untenable. The decision was made to conduct a strategic withdrawal to a more defensible line closer to the 38th parallel. At the same time, the Hungnam evacuation became a logistical triumph amidst chaos. Over 2 weeks, a massive sea lift operation moved more than 100 000 troops, 17 500 vehicles, and 350 000 tons of supplies out of the port, along with nearly 100 000 civilian refugees seeking to escape advancing communist forces. The evacuation, conducted under the threat of Chinese encirclement and in sub-zero temperatures, symbolized both the vulnerability and resilience of the UN effort. It was a retreat, but it was also a feat of organization and compassion, ensuring that thousands of civilians avoided the fate of being trapped in the war zone. The harshness of the winter cannot be overstated. In addition to combat casualties, frostbite, trench foot, hypothermia, and malnutrition took a devastating toll. UN medical units reported treating tens of thousands of cold-related injuries. Frostbite could set in within minutes, turning skin white and waxy, and if untreated, leading to amputation. Soldiers improvised constantly stuffing newspapers into boots for insulation, using vehicle exhaust to thaw weapons, and learning to keep canteens inside their coats to prevent water from freezing. The Chinese, many of whom were peasants from northern provinces accustomed to harsh winters, were somewhat better adapted, but even they suffered heavily from the cold, with thousands incapacitated by frostbite and illness. The extreme conditions also limited the effectiveness of heavy weapons. Artillery shells sometimes failed to detonate in frozen ground, and lubricants thickened to the point of seizing moving parts. As December turned to January 1951, the Chinese launched yet another wave of attacks, determined to push the UN forces entirely out of Korea. The third phase offensive struck south of the 38th parallel, targeting Seoul once again. UN forces, still regrouping and reinforcing after the retreat, faced the prospect of losing the capital for a second time. The fighting was intense, often in urban areas and across frozen rivers. Bridges became focal points of defense and destruction, with retreating forces blowing them to slow the Chinese advance. Refugee flows again surged southward, adding a tragic civilian dimension to the military struggle. In these weeks, the harsh winter offensive was as much about movement as it was about holding ground retreats. Withdrawals and rearguard actions dominated the tactical picture. In strategic terms, the harsh winter offensive shattered any illusions of a quick and decisive end to the Korean War. It forced UN commanders to reassess their objectives, recognizing that the war had shifted from an offensive liberation campaign to a defensive effort aimed at preventing the complete conquest of South Korea. The Chinese had demonstrated both the will and the capability to sustain large-scale operations despite enormous logistical challenges. For the UN, the campaign underscored the importance of adapting to the terrain and climate, as well as the necessity of securing robust supply lines and winter equipment for future operations. Politically, the events of the winter deepened divisions among the Allies and within the United States itself. General MacArthur, unwilling to accept a stalemate, continued to press for expanded operations, even suggesting the use of nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan and the bombing of Chinese territory. President Harry S. Truman and other political leaders, wary of escalating the war into a broader conflict with China or even the Soviet Union, sought a more cautious approach. The strain between military ambition and political restraint would come to a head in the months following the harsh winter offensive, eventually culminating in MacArthur's dismissal. In the human dimension, the campaign left an indelible mark on those who endured it. Veterans would recall the bone-deep cold, the unending marches, and the sudden, violent clashes with an enemy who seemed to materialize from the snow itself. The bond between soldiers forged in such adversity became legendary stories of men sharing their last cigarettes, carrying wounded comrades for miles, or refusing to leave anyone behind, even at great personal risk, circulated widely in the years after the war. Civilians who survived the winter carried their own memories of nights spent hiding from shell fire, of hunger and frostbite, of separation from loved ones in the chaos of evacuation. Ultimately, the harsh winter offensive was not a decisive victory for either side in the traditional sense. The Chinese succeeded in halting the UN advance and regaining large swaths of territory, but they did not destroy the UN forces or force them entirely from the peninsula. The UN, though compelled to retreat, preserved its core fighting strength and stabilized the front in the months that followed. What the campaign did achieve was a grim equilibrium of recognition by both sides that the Korean War was evolving into a protracted, grinding conflict in which endurance might prove as important as tactical brilliance. In retrospect, the harsh winter offensive stands as a testament to the interplay between climate, terrain, and strategy in modern warfare. It demonstrated that even in an age of mechanization, air power, and advanced weaponry, the natural environment could shape the outcome of battles as profoundly as the actions of generals and politicians. For the soldiers on the frozen hills of Korea, it was a season of survival, sacrifice, and stoic determination, a crucible, in which the limits of human endurance were tested and, in many cases, surpassed. The Korean War's 10th chapter, the long and grinding stalemate at the 38th parallel, unfolded as a drawn-out and brutal struggle that tested the endurance of both soldiers and nations. By early 1951, the initial frenzy of rapid advances and retreats marked by the dramatic swings from the North Korean invasion, the United Nations counteroffensive, the Chinese intervention, and the desperate battles of the harsh winter had given way to a tense equilibrium. The shifting lines that had once raced from the southern tip of the peninsula at Pusan to the Yalu River in the north had now slowed and hardened around. The 38th parallel, the pre-war boundary that both sides had crossed and recrossed. It was almost as if the war had returned to its starting point, but now with countless lives lost, cities shattered, and a deep bitterness entrenched in both camps. The stalemate was not the result of passivity. Rather, it was the outcome of fierce, unrelenting offensives and counteroffensives that gradually exhausted their momentum against a backdrop of rugged hills, well-fortified ridgelines, and a climate that alternated between blistering summers and bitter, freezing winters. The geography of Korea's mountainous central spine, deep river valleys, and limited road networks meant that large-scale armored thrusts were difficult. And as both sides dug in, the conflict began to resemble the positional warfare of World War I, complete with trenches, bunkers, and artillery duels. When the front stabilized in mid-1951, General Matthew Ridgway, who had taken over command of UN forces after General MacArthur's dismissal, focused on consolidating positions, improving supply lines, and conducting limited offensives designed to push the Chinese People's Volunteer Army PVA and the Korean People's Army KPA back from strategically important ridges and hilltops. These were not massive, sweeping operations aimed at decisive breakthroughs. Instead, they were carefully calculated to gain modest tactical advantages, such as controlling higher ground for observation and artillery spotting. The Chinese, for their part, adapted their tactics as well. The massed human wave assaults that had shocked UN forces during the winter of 1950-51 were less effective now that UN troops were better dug in and supported by concentrated artillery and air power. Instead, the PVA and KPA relied on a mix of infiltration, night attacks, and stubborn defense of key terrain features, often accepting high casualties to hold a hill or delay an advance. Every gain by one side was matched by a counter move from the other, and these battles for small patches of ground, sometimes no more than a few hundred yards across, came at a terrible cost. One of the defining features of the stalemate period was the transformation of the battlefield into a network of fortified zones. The UN line was anchored by strong points with code names like Heartbreak Ridge, Bloody Ridge, Old Baldy Ridge, Old Baldy Ridge, Old Baldy Ridge, Old Baldy Ridge, Old Baldy, and Pork Chop Hill names that would become synonymous with grinding. Attritional combat, each of these ridges became the focus of sustained fighting, often lasting weeks, where control shifted back and forth under the weight of relentless artillery barrages and infantry assaults. The Chinese also fortified their positions heavily, constructing elaborate tunnel systems, bunkers, and trench networks that allowed them to shelter from bombardment and move troops relatively safely to the front. This was especially important given the UN's overwhelming air superiority. Daylight movement in the open was almost suicidal for PVA-KPA units, as fighter bombers and attack aircraft prowled the skies, ready to strike at any exposed targets. The UN Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps aircraft bomb supply depots, troop concentrations, and transportation routes, attempting to choke off the Chinese logistical network. But the enemy proved adept at moving supplies at night and using camouflage to avoid detection. As both sides settled into this pattern of positional warfare, the political dimension of the conflict began to take on greater prominence. In July 1951, armistice negotiations began at Kaesong, later moving to Panmunjom, a small village just north of the 38th parallel. The talks were an acknowledgement by both sides that outright victory was unlikely without unacceptable losses. but they quickly became mired in disputes. The main sticking points included the precise location of the ceasefire line, the establishment of a demilitarized zone EDMZ, and, most contentiously, the issue of prisoner repatriation. The United Nations Command insisted on the principle of voluntary repatriation, meaning that prisoners of war, POWs, should not be forced to return to a country they did not wish to go back to, an idea that infuriated the Chinese and North Koreans, who wanted all POWs returned regardless of their personal wishes. This dispute dragged on for months, even years, with both sides using the slow pace of negotiations to justify continued fighting at the front. Indeed, some historians argue that the fighting during the stalemate was driven less by hopes of a decisive military outcome than by a desire to improve bargaining. Positions at the negotiating table, life for the soldiers on the front lines during the stalemate was grueling and monotonous in equal measure. In the trenches, men contended with mud rats, lice, and the ever-present threat of enemy snipers and artillery. Nights were often punctuated by flares and bursts of gunfire as patrols clashed in no man's land or infiltrators probed the wire. The bitter Korean winters brought sub-zero temperatures, snowstorms, and frostbite, while the humid summers brought swarms of insects and the stench of decaying bodies left in the narrow spaces between lines. Morale fluctuated, boosted by rest periods in rear areas or news from home, but dampened by the realization that the war had become a seemingly endless grind with no clear end in sight. For many soldiers, the stalemate meant months of holding the same hill or stretch of trench, punctuated by sudden, violent bursts of combat when the enemy launched an attack or the order came to seize an opposing position. The war of attrition also placed immense demands on logistics and supply. The UN command maintained a vast supply network to keep the front fed, armed, and equipped, relying on ports like Pusan and the rebuilt railways to move material northward. Ammunition consumption was staggering, particularly in artillery shells. UN artillery units fired hundreds of thousands of rounds during the stalemate period, using firepower to break up assaults or soften defenses before an attack. The Chinese, lacking comparable artillery resources, relied more heavily on manpower and ingenuity, constructing concealed positions and using mass night assaults to overwhelm defenders before reinforcements could arrive. Still, they too faced immense logistical challenges, particularly given the destruction of transportation routes by UN air power. Convoys of porters, often carrying supplies on their backs or using pack animals, became a lifeline for Chinese frontline units. Throughout this period, both sides experimented with tactics to break the deadlock. The UN conducted limited offensives, often called show of force operations, aimed at seizing specific hills or improving defensive lines. One such example was Operation Commando in October 1951, in which UN forces captured a series of ridges north of the Incheon River, pushing the front slightly forward and improving their bargaining position in negotiations. The Chinese responded with their own offensives, sometimes targeting weak points in the UN line or attempting to recapture lost ground. However, each side's defenses were generally strong enough to prevent major breakthroughs, and gains were usually measured in yards rather than miles. The cost of these operations was high, with casualty lists mounting even in the absence of large-scale battles. The stalemate at the 38th parallel also saw an increased role for special operations, reconnaissance, and psychological warfare. UN and Republic of Korea OK units conducted raids behind enemy lines to disrupt supply routes or gather intelligence, while propaganda units broadcast messages to enemy troops, urging them to surrender or defect. The Chinese and North Koreans likewise used propaganda, both on the battlefield and through radio broadcasts aimed at UN troops, highlighting racial discrimination in the United States or suggesting that the war was being prolonged for cynical political reasons. While the effectiveness of such efforts is debated, they were part of the broader struggle to sap the enemy's will to fight. Internationally, the stalemate period was marked by growing frustration among the United States allies, as well as by debates within the American government about the war's aims. President Harry Truman's administration had already made the decision not to expand the war into China despite calls from some quarters for bombing Chinese bases or even using nuclear weapons, and now faced the challenge of sustaining public support for a war that seemed to be going nowhere. In many respects, the stalemate tested the political will of both coalitions more than their military capabilities. The Chinese leadership, under Mao Zedong, viewed holding the line in Korea as a matter of national prestige and security, while the United States and its allies saw it as a critical stand against communist expansion in Asia. As the months turned into years, The war's toll on civilians continued to mount. Towns and villages near the front were repeatedly shelled or bombed, and many had been reduced to rubble. Refugees, already displaced by earlier campaigns, found themselves unable to return home, surviving in makeshift camps or moving from one ruined settlement to another. The longer the fighting continued, the more the civilian population suffered from shortages of food, medicine, and shelter. This human cost weighed heavily on the negotiations, but it also hardened attitudes, making compromise more difficult. By late 1952, it was clear that neither side could achieve a decisive military victory without unacceptable costs. The war had settled into a grim rhythm. Negotiations at Panmunjom by day, artillery duels and patrol clashes by night. Each side sought to demonstrate resolve and capability, even as both recognized that the fighting was achieving little beyond killing more soldiers and civilians. The eventual armistice would not come until July 1953, but the essence of the settlement, the division of Korea along a line close to the 38th parallel, was already a reality by the end of 1951. The stalemate was, in many ways, the war's defining phase, encapsulating its blend of intense combat, political deadlock, and human suffering. It was a testament to the determination and resilience of the soldiers on both sides, but also a sobering reminder of the limits of military power when political objectives are inflexible and the terrain favors defense over offense. When people think of the Korean War, they often picture the muddy foxholes, the bitter winter fighting, and the shifting front lines along the rugged Korean Peninsula. Yet, an equally critical dimension of this conflict played out far above in the skies and far out at sea. The air and naval battles of the Korean War were not mere supporting acts, they were decisive. Multi-layered campaigns that influenced the war's tempo, logistics, and morale for both sides. This chapter delves into the intense aerial duels, strategic bombing missions, carrier-based operations, and the sweeping naval engagements that defined the war's maritime and aerial theaters from 1950 to 1953. From the first days of the conflict to the uneasy stalemate of the later years, the United Nations' overwhelming command of the sea and eventual dominance of the air proved essential in preventing a complete South Korean collapse and sustaining the war. Effort against the North Korean and Chinese forces. When North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel on the 25th of June 1950, the element of surprise was mirrored in the skies. The fledgling Republic of Korea Air Force, broke half, had only a small handful of liaison planes and no combat aircraft capable of challenging the North Soviet-supplied fighters. North Korean Yakovlev Yak-9 fighters and Ilyushin Il-10 ground attack aircraft quickly established air superiority over the peninsula in the first days, strafing retreating South Korean columns, bombing transport routes, and harassing refugee flows. Without immediate intervention, the North could maintain a chokehold over both the air and ground battles. However, within hours of the invasion, the United States Far East Air Forces, FEAF, under General George Stratemeyer, swung into action, deploying long-range bombers, carrier air groups, and fighter squadrons from bases in Japan to blunt the North's advance. This rapid mobilization marked the beginning of a sustained aerial campaign that would expand into one of the most intense air wars since World War II. Initially, UN air operations had two urgent goals: interdict North Korean supply lines and prevent their forces from using the air unchallenged. B-26 Invader light bombers flew some of the earliest interdiction sorties, targeting bridges over the Han River and key rail choke points north of Seoul. F-80 Shooting Stars, one of the first operational U.S. jet fighters, were deployed alongside piston-engine F-51 Mustangs, which, despite being World War II veterans, proved invaluable for their long range and ability to operate from primitive airstrips close to the front. The North Koreans, operating largely from captured airfields in the south, attempted to mount resistance, but the relatively small and inexperienced air arm soon found itself overmatched. By early July 1950, UN aircraft were beginning to tilt the air balance, and within weeks, they had driven most North Korean air activity north of the 38th parallel. While the battle in the air was taking shape, the naval war was moving just as rapidly. The Korean Peninsula's geography bounded on three sides by water meant that control of the seas could dramatically alter the strategic picture. In the opening hours of the war, U.S. and British warships of the United Nations Command moved quickly to establish a blockade of the North Korean coastline. The U.S. 7th Fleet, led by carriers such as USS Valley Forge CV-45, and later joined by British carriers like HMS Triumph, began launching airstrikes from the Yellow Sea and the Sea of Japan. Destroyers and cruisers pounded coastal targets with naval gunfire, disrupting troop movements along the shore and preventing North Korea from resupplying via maritime routes. This blockade not only cut the North's supply lines, but also gave the UN the freedom to conduct amphibious operations at an advantage that would prove decisive. During General MacArthur's bold Incheon landing later that year, the role of carrier aviation in the Korean War cannot be overstated. With many Korean airfields damaged in enemy hands or lacking adequate facilities, carriers provided mobile, flexible air bases capable of delivering sustained air power close to the front. From these decks, Corsairs, Sky Raiders, and jet fighters flew ground attack, close air support, and interdiction missions. The rhythm of carrier operations was relentless sorties launched at dawn to soften enemy positions, followed by waves of close air support for embattled UN troops, and then interdiction runs to sever North Korean logistics as the day wore on. Naval aviation also played a crucial role in protecting shipping lanes and supply convoys bound for Korean ports like Pusan, ensuring the flow of troops, tanks, ammunition, and food to the front lines. As the war progressed into late 1950 and 1951, the nature of the air war shifted dramatically with the sudden intervention of Chinese forces and the introduction of Soviet-designed MiG-15 jet fighters. These swept-wing jets, operating from bases in Manchuria beyond the reach of most UN fighters due to political restrictions on crossing the Yalu River, posed a formidable challenge to the FEF. The MiGs were faster, climbed more quickly, and could outperform many of the early UN jets. To counter this, the United States rushed in the F-86 Sabre, a state-of-the-art swept-wing jet whose performance matched the MiGs in speed and agility, but surpassed it in handling and dive characteristics. What followed was an intense series of aerial duels over northwestern Korea, in an area soon nicknamed MiG Alley. MiG Alley became the stage for some of the most storied jet-age dogfights in history. Pilots from both sides, American, Soviet, flying in disguise as Chinese or North Korean, and Chinese engaged in high-speed battles at altitudes exceeding 40,000 feet. The Sabres, often flown by World War II veterans, used superior tactics, radar-assisted gun sights, and disciplined formations to steadily gain the upper hand. Air-to-air combat in this arena was brutal and unforgiving. Victories were measured in fractions of seconds, and losses could occur just as swiftly. By 1952, UN pilots had established a favorable kill ratio, though the MiG threat remained potent until the war's end. Meanwhile, the strategic air campaign deepened. B-29 superfortresses, once the terror of Japanese cities in World War II, were repurposed for high-altitude precision bombing of North Korean industrial centers, power plants, rail yards, and supply depots, initially operating with minimal fighter escort. These lumbering bombers became increasingly vulnerable to MiG-15 interceptions, prompting the development of elaborate escort tactics and the use of electronic countermeasures. By crippling the North's industrial base and transportation network, the strategic bombing campaign sought to limit the enemy's ability to wage prolonged war. Yet, political and humanitarian concerns prevented the total destruction of North Korea's infrastructure. Targets were carefully selected to avoid escalating the conflict into a broader war with China or the Soviet Union. The naval war, too, evolved into a campaign of sustained pressure and interdiction. Minesweeping operations became a crucial and dangerous task, as both sides laid extensive minefields to deny access to key ports and coastal areas. The mining of Wonsan Harbor in 1950 delayed amphibious operations and underscored the vulnerability of UN ships to well-placed naval mines. Throughout the war, destroyers and cruisers conducted train busting, missions, firing at North Korean trains moving along coastal tracks, while amphibious raids and reconnaissance missions kept enemy forces off balance. The blockade of North Korea remained airtight, strangling maritime supply and forcing the North to rely almost entirely on overland routes through China and the Soviet Union. Air and naval operations were not without cost. UN aircraft faced heavy anti-aircraft fire, particularly when striking targets in heavily defended zones near Pyongyang and the Yalu River. Carrier aircraft risked crash landings on pitching decks in rough seas, while naval vessels endured shell fire from coastal batteries and the constant threat of mines. Yet, the overwhelming industrial and logistical capacity of the United States and its allies ensured that losses could be replaced and operations sustained indefinitely. By the final year of the war, the dominance of UN forces at sea was absolute, and in the air, it was nearly complete. The Chinese and North Koreans still fielded MiG-15s, but their operations were increasingly cautious, and their ability to contest air superiority over the front lines was minimal. UN air power continued to provide close air support to ground troops, strike enemy supply lines, and carry out psychological warfare missions, such as leaflet drops urging enemy troops to surrender. Naval forces maintained the blockade and supported amphibious feints to tie down enemy units along the coast. When the armistice was finally signed in July 1953, the air and naval campaigns had achieved their strategic aims. They had prevented the North from resupplying by sea, limited their freedom of movement on land, provided a constant umbrella of protection for UN forces, and inflicted sustained damage on enemy infrastructure and morale. The Korean War, often called the Forgotten War, was in many ways the proving ground for modern jet combat and carrier warfare, and it demonstrated the enduring value of sea control and air superiority in limited conflicts. The legacy of these battles lived on in military doctrine, pilot training, and naval aviation strategy for decades to come. By the late summer of 1951, the Korean War had entered a frustrating and deadly stalemate, with neither the United Nations, the UN, forces nor the Chinese-North Korean coalition able to secure a decisive breakthrough. The front lines had largely stabilized near the 38th parallel after months of dramatic advances and retreats, and a grim realization began to take hold among commanders on both sides. The conflict was shifting away from sweeping maneuvers across the Korean Peninsula to an exhausting contest over rugged terrain, particularly a series of strategically important hills and ridgelines. These hill battles, fought in the latter stages of the war, had come to define the experience of tens of thousands of soldiers. While political negotiators met intermittently at Panmunjom to discuss an armistice, the fighting on the ground escalated into a bloody grind where control over seemingly small patches of high ground could mean tactical superiority, better observation of enemy movements, and psychological advantage at the bargaining table. This chapter, War on the Hills, delves deeply into that phase, unpacking the context, the ferocity of the fighting, the key engagements such as Bloody Ridge, Heartbreak Ridge, Old Baldy, and Pork Chop Hill, and the human and political costs of a war reduced to incremental territorial struggles. The shift to hill warfare was partly the result of both sides digging in after the rapid movement campaigns of 1951. When the front solidified, commanders recognized that Korea's geography heavily favored whoever controlled the higher ground. Hills and ridges not only offered natural defensive advantages, but also served as ideal artillery observation posts. In the absence of large-scale offensives, capturing these elevations became an operational priority. For UN forces, primarily US, South Korean AROK, and Commonwealth troops taking key hills could disrupt enemy supply lines, deny observation over their own positions, and demonstrate resolve to the communist negotiators. For Chinese and North Korean forces, holding or retaking these positions was equally vital to protect their defensive belts and to project strength in the ongoing armistice talks. As a result, hills that might have seemed militarily insignificant on a global map became sites of relentless, high-casualty engagements lasting days, weeks, or even months. One of the earliest and most notorious hill battles was Bloody Ridge in late August and September 1951. Located in east-central Korea, this ridge system was held by the Korean People's Army, KPA, and served as a major defensive line. The U.S. 2nd Infantry Division, alongside ROK units, was tasked with capturing it. The battle was characterized by repeated assaults up steep slopes under intense enemy fire, with gains often measured in yards and lost again in counterattacks. Mortar and artillery fire rained down constantly, and the heavily entrenched KPA defenders fought with determination, making use of deep bunkers and interlocking fields of fire. After nearly 3 weeks of fighting, UN forces secured the ridgebud at a cost of thousands of casualties. Yet, as would become a pattern, the victory was quickly followed by another assault just a few miles away at Heartbreak Ridge, became emblematic of the futility and savagery of the hill battles. This 7-mile-long ridge complex was assaulted by UN forces in September-October 1951. The operation was intended to follow up on the gains at Bloody Ridge and to break through a key segment of the enemy's defensive line. However, the battle quickly devolved into an attritional nightmare. The terrain was so steep that tanks had to be airlifted in sections to provide fire support, and every assault met with withering machine gun and mortar fire from Chinese and North Korean defenders. Even when UN troops seized a crest, they were subjected to ferocious counterattacks. The cycle of attack, counterattack, and renewed attack ground on for weeks. In the end, the ridge was captured, But the cost in blood was staggering, and the strategic situation barely changed. By 1952, the war had fully transitioned into positional combat, and new hill names entered the grim lexicon of the soldiers' Old Baldy Porkchop Hill, White Horse Triangle Hill, and others. Each became the center of battles that could last days or months, often fought over ground that had little inherent value except for the prestige and negotiating leverage it provided. At Old Baldy, for instance, control shifted back and forth multiple times between UN and Chinese forces. The hills bare. Shellpock Summit offered excellent observation of enemy positions, but its exposed slopes made any advance a deadly proposition. Similar dynamics played at Porkchop Hill, where battles in both 1952 and 1953 saw U.S. and Chinese troops inflict and suffer heavy casualties for control of a few hundred yards of devastated earth. These fights often took place at night, with hand-to-hand combat in trenches and bunkers illuminated by flares and explosions, creating a surreal, nightmarish battlefield. One of the striking aspects of the hill battles was the immense role of artillery. Both sides deployed thousands of artillery pieces, mortars and rocket launchers, turning the contested hills into moonscapes. Artillery barrages could last for hours or even days before an infantry assault, and counter barrages were constant. In some engagements, artillery alone caused the majority of casualties. Soldiers huddled in bunkers or foxholes, enduring the psychological strain of relentless shelling. Medical evacuation under fire was perilous, and the steep terrain made it physically exhausting to carry the wounded down the slopes. Supply lines also came under constant threat, with porters and vehicles moving under cover of darkness to avoid enemy fire. The human experience of the war on the hills was one of exhaustion, fear, and grim determination. Soldiers described the overpowering stench of decaying bodies left in no man's land, the deafening roar of artillery, the cold and wet conditions in foxholes, and the grinding monotony punctuated by moments of sheer terror during an assault. For many, the hills symbolized the futility of the war positions captured at great cost only to be abandoned later or rendered tactically irrelevant by changes in the front. Yet, the battles also became a crucible for unit cohesion as soldiers relied heavily on one another to survive in the brutal conditions. Politically, the hill battles were part of a larger psychological war. Negotiators at Panmunjom paid close attention to developments at the front, and each side sought to demonstrate toughness and resilience through these fights. Victories on the battlefield were used as bargaining chips, even when they offered little practical military gain. Conversely, heavy losses could weaken morale and bargaining positions. The Chinese leadership, in particular, often launched local offensives to seize high ground before or during critical negotiation phases, while UN commanders ordered assaults to disrupt enemy plans or signal resolve. By the time the armistice was signed in July 1953, the war on the hills had claimed tens of thousands of lives and left the Korean landscape deeply scarred. The final front line, the military demarcation line MDN, barely differed from the one established after the stalemate set in 2 years earlier. Many of the hills that were fought over with such ferocity ended up in the demilitarized zone DMZ, serving as silent memorials to the soldiers who had died there. The war on the hills did not alter the strategic outcome of the Korean War, but it encapsulated the grim reality of limited war in the nuclear age, immense sacrifices for limited, often symbolic gains. In retrospect, historians view the hill battles as both a tragedy and a testament. They were a tragedy in the sense that they consumed enormous human lives and resources for minimal territorial changes, and a testament to the resilience and courage of the soldiers who endured them. The names Bloody Ridge, Heartbreak Ridge, Porkchop Hill still evoke images of sacrifice and futility. They remind us that in the Korean War, as in many other conflicts, the fight for even a few yards of ground could become an epic struggle, reflecting not just military necessity but also political theater and the stubborn human will to endure.